So I would like to start today's conversation with Christian Marlin, who is based in Ecuador, and many would say is kind of the birthplace of fine cacao. And Christian, if you could give the audience a little bit about your background, what you are doing in Ecuador so that they have an understanding of who you are.
Sí, muy buenos días con todos. Un gusto estar reunido con este mundo del cacao, que es un mundo tan apasionante. Me llamo Christian Marlin, yo trabajo ahora como jefe de misión de una asistencia internacional en el Ecuador, pero yo diría que en los 10 últimos años he trabajado de cerca con la cadena del cacao, con productores, con intermediarios, con industriales y exportadores, tratando de contribuir un poco a la formulación de políticas y estrategias para el sector cacaotero en Ecuador. Yo soy agroeconomista, soy francés, pero vivo en el Ecuador ya más de 25 años. Muchas gracias.
Wonderful. So, Christian, my first question for you is how would you describe the development of the cacao sector in Ecuador in the last 10 years, framing it in the development of the sector at the world level?
Sí, yo creo que el sector cacaotero, yo diría en la última década, ha tenido cambios trascendentales. Si partimos de una pirámide más o menos de 4 millones de toneladas de producción, tradicionalmente teníamos un pequeño segmento de cacao super premium que se vendían a precios muy altos, entre 5,000 y 10,000 dólares la tonelada, que era menos del 0.5% de todo lo que se produce. Después tenemos los cacaos finos, que son alrededor de 5% de todo lo que se produce y que se venden alrededor de entre 3,000 y 5,000 dólares la tonelada. Entonces, eso sería el segmento de los cacaos realmente de muy alta calidad. Después tenemos un segmento, y ahí donde creo que están los mayores cambios, que son cacaos ordinarios a nivel de calidad, pero con algún tipo de certificación en cuanto a sostenibilidad ambiental, sostenibilidad social, que actualmente es alrededor del 10% de todo lo que se consume. Y el resto, como 85%, es cacao commodity de calidad bastante común, realmente con muy pocos procesos de fermentación, secados, no de muy buena calidad, pero que representa la gran masa de la producción mundial. Yo diría que en las últimas décadas lo que ha ido cambiando es el ojo del consumidor, que no solamente se preocupa para tener un producto bueno, bonito y barato, pero también tener un producto sostenible a nivel social y ambiental, como resultado de todos los escándalos que hubo alrededor de temas de deforestación, de trabajo infantil, de esclavitud, que lleva realmente una muy mala conciencia de los consumidores en los países desarrollados en particular. Y eso ha hecho que este segmento de los cacaos ordinarios con algún tipo de certificación está creciendo de forma acelerada y responde a una demanda real de los consumidores. Entonces yo creo que el gran desafío es de cómo garantizar al consumidor que además de la calidad organoléptica, atrás hay historias de vida de productores que tienen condiciones de vida dignas, que respetan el medio ambiente y que contribuyen a un desarrollo más sostenible.
Those comments that you just made regarding the sustainable quality of life and the consumer in wanting to make sure that the farmer has that, those have actually been reflected in research that the Fine Chocolate Industry Association has done on consumer preferences. So I'm glad to hear you mention that. My next question is, how is it possible that Ecuador has had such steady growth?
Sí, Ecuador ha tenido, cuando hablamos de boom cacaotero, en Ecuador siempre se pensaba en lo que pasó en el siglo XIX, pero en realidad el verdadero boom cacaotero es ahora. Solamente para darle una cifra, en el año 2005 Ecuador exportaba 55.000 toneladas. En el año 2021, Ecuador exportó más de 400.000 toneladas, pasando a ser el tercer exportador mundial. Es decir, se multiplicó por casi 10 el volumen de producción en estos 15 años. Ahora, la principal razón de eso, yo creo que es primero el descubrimiento de una nueva variedad que es resistente a las dos peores enfermedades del cacao, que es la monilla y la escoba de bruja. Esta variedad, que se llama CCN51, ha permitido que inicialmente grandes haciendas y medianas haciendas empiecen a hacer buenos negocios con el cacao. Pero los pequeños productores alrededor empezaron a ver estas haciendas con hermosas plantaciones de cacao y poco a poco adoptaron esta variedad, pero por ser resistente a estas dos enfermedades, la productividad fue creciente y explica en buena parte el incremento de la producción, es decir, un aumento de la producción, de la productividad por esta variedad. La segunda razón es un aumento de la superficie, ya que el cacao se volvió un cultivo económicamente atractivo y empezó a sustituir plantaciones de palma aceitera, potreros para la ganadería extensiva. Poco a poco se fueron transformando en nuevas plantaciones de cacao, y es por eso hoy en día Ecuador son más de 600.000 hectáreas de cacao, es decir, realmente de lejos el primer cultivo agrícola del país, del Ecuador en este caso.
So the next follow-up question after that is, how do you see the growth of fine cacao versus the bulk cacao, the growth of fine cacao in Ecuador?
Sí, yo creo que la chocolatería fina, yo me acuerdo cuando yo llegué a Ecuador hace 25 años, era imposible encontrar un buen chocolate en el Ecuador. A pesar que había la fama del mejor cacao del mundo, el chocolate que se compraba en los supermercados, en las tiendas, era realmente bastante mediocre, por no decir malo. Eso ha cambiado completamente en estas dos últimas décadas, y ahora en Ecuador uno puede encontrar realmente chocolates de muy buena calidad. Y eso yo creo que es sumamente importante, porque un país no puede darse la imagen del mejor cacao del mundo o el mejor chocolate del mundo si sus productores y sus consumidores no lo aprecian. Es como si hablaríamos de Francia, mi país, productor de vino, y que los franceses no tomen buen vino. Yo creo que Francia ha logrado en vino a exportar el 60, el 70% de su producción de vino porque tiene la imagen, y los franceses son sumamente exigentes en la calidad del vino que consumen. En el caso de Ecuador y del chocolate es lo mismo. Si Ecuador se quiere posicionar como un exportador del mejor chocolate del mundo, tiene que poder encontrar buen chocolate en el Ecuador y que los ecuatorianos empiecen realmente a apreciar su producto por su calidad. Entonces, eso es algo que está empezando. Todavía hay mucho camino por recorrer, pero me parece algo fundamental que se trabaje a promocionar el consumo de muy buen chocolate en el Ecuador para tener una vitrina en el país, y que los extranjeros, los turistas, cuando vengan a Ecuador, puedan ver y consumir chocolate de muy buena calidad. Es un poco como, yo diría que cacao en Ecuador es un poco como el café de Colombia. En Colombia, cuando en cualquier país del mundo se habla de Colombia, la gente inmediatamente piensa en café de Colombia. Y eso fue un trabajo de posicionamiento de la marca Café de Colombia en muchos eventos internacionales, y logró posicionar eso. Yo creo que Ecuador, por su historia en cacao, por la importancia del cultivo a nivel económico, a nivel social, a nivel ambiental, tiene que apostarle en tener el cacao y el chocolate como producto emblemático de presentación del país a nivel internacional.
So in your opinion, what are the most important opportunities in fine cocoa for Ecuador? Would you say it's the tourism? Would you say it's, you know, developing markets and customers domestically?
Yo creo que en un primer tiempo la oportunidad para el chocolate fino es el mercado interno, que sea de población ecuatoriana o de turistas que vienen a visitar el Ecuador. Porque posicionar una marca de chocolate a nivel internacional es sumamente complicado, costoso, se tiene que hacerlo. Yo creo que hay algunas iniciativas interesantes para posicionar a nivel internacional, pero si hablamos de desarrollo del sector chocolatero, creo que en un primer tiempo, primero se tiene que buscar el mercado nacional. Es decir, que actualmente sobre las más o menos 400.000 toneladas, menos del 1% se transforma en chocolate para la exportación. El 95% es cacao en grano y el 5-7% restante es semi-elaborado. Entonces, en chocolate, diría que primero el mercado nacional con, para los mejores, algunos esfuerzos para colocar a nivel internacional. Pero eso sí es muy difícil, muy costoso y largo. Yo digo que el mercado internacional de exportación para el chocolate fino sería para el mediano plazo. A corto plazo, concentrarse en el mercado interno.
Thank you. And just to kind of transition to the next segue of this presentation, looking at the sustainability initiative in West Africa and the search for a minimum price for cocoa in that region, what do you think about a better price for farmers in Latin America?
La primera cosa, la diferencia fuerte entre África y América Latina es que en África muchas veces, especialmente en los dos principales productores, Ghana y Costa de Marfil, el precio es controlado por el Estado. Entonces hay precios mínimos fijados por el gobierno y son países cuya economía vive en gran parte con estos impuestos sobre el cacao. Entonces, en África, el productor recibe entre el 60 y 70% del precio de bolsa, llega realmente al productor. En América Latina, Ecuador, Perú y Colombia, estamos alrededor del 80-85% del precio de bolsa que llega a nivel del productor. Ahora, yo creo que la sostenibilidad la gente va a adoptar modelos de producción sostenible siempre y cuando haya un incentivo económico que recompensa los esfuerzos a realizar. Por eso es fundamental que la sostenibilidad sea pagada en función del costo que eso representa. Y ahí un tema fundamental es el tema de la asociatividad. Es muy difícil, un país como Ecuador, estamos hablando de 190.000 familias de pequeños productores cacaoteros, del cual menos del 10% están en algún tipo de organización. Si primero la gente no se organiza en asociaciones o en cooperativas, es casi imposible poder trabajar al mejoramiento del precio a través de la comercialización, a través de la mejora de la calidad, a través de una venta más directa. Todo eso pasa por procesos asociativos y cooperativistas. Entonces, yo creo que eso debe ser el desafío del país para los próximos años, de lograr organizar a los pequeños productores para que puedan acceder a mejores precios vía la comercialización directa y el mejoramiento de la calidad.
Thank you, Christian, for that commentary. And now that we've started talking about West Africa, I would like to introduce our next panelist, Selassie Atadika. She is joining us from Ghana. And Selassie, welcome to the panel. Selassie grew up in the US, was educated in top universities. She has a degree in geography, modified with environmental studies from Dartmouth, a master's degree in international affairs from Columbia University, and the School of Public Affairs. And she also studied at the Culinary Institute of America. So how did you make that transition from being in the US to returning to Ghana and starting your company? And tell us a little bit about your company too, as well.
Sure. Well, I was working with the UN and I did a lot of traveling around the continent and just eating my way through and just tasting amazing flavors. I sort of happened upon just really fantastic cuisine, but I realized that a lot of people didn't know about. And I wanted to share that, and my sort of blessing of being able to have had that experience, and went to the Culinary Institute of America to sort of formalize that. Moved back to Ghana 8 years ago and really have been on a journey to see different ways in which to share Africa's culinary heritage, either through my dinners, and through the dinners, we did the chocolates as mignardises at the end of the meal, and started getting a lot of requests for that. And so they've taken on a life of its own. And it's been really wonderful to be able to share sort of this journey through chocolate.
So starting a business is challenging in any country, but what were some of the challenges you faced in Ghana as a woman working with chocolate?
I think when I first started off, it actually kind of one of the, you see Ghanaian cocoa all over the world, but then I really was like, why are we not producing? And I should probably do that. And it just seemed like a no-brainer and something that shouldn't be that complicated.
So you thought?
I thought, yeah, this is something that maybe people haven't thought about yet, and I don't know why, but let me just, jump into it and see where it goes. Of course, chocolate and heat is a kryptonite.
Yes.
Humidity is kryptonite, and we have both of those things in surplus in Ghana. So I think that the climate is always the first element that's challenging. We do have amazing cocoa, but then you realize that some of the other ingredients that are required for an amazing chocolate product are not visible. So we don't have a major dairy industry. So in terms of like trying to make milk chocolate, the equipment wasn't being produced locally. The staff or the and people that you could bring onto your team weren't there, so a lot of the elements were missing, and a lot of the policies were not there. So for much of our history, Ghana has been a place where we have been exporting cocoa, and so the infrastructure and the policies are not in place for actually local production. So those are some of the major challenges that I've had to sort of deal with. I think I've always been someone who's been in a space that wasn't necessarily built for myself. So I've always kind of done whatever I needed to do or moved in a space. So, being a chef in Ghana, being a female chef in Ghana, being a Black female chef in Ghana and owning your own space are not things that are very common. So it's kind of always been an upward climb, but I'm always ready for a good challenge.
Great. And one of the challenges that you face is the legal landscape for acquiring cocoa in Ghana. Yeah. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, Christian was, mentioned a bit about the cocoa and it being something that's been controlled by the government, and very much still is. And so at the moment, the policies are set up so that the cocoa farmers sell to the government, and then the government then has licensed buying companies who procure the cocoa from those licensed buying companies. So at the moment, the laws have yet to change. There are conversations happening around it, but nothing has changed. So it's currently illegal for me to purchase cocoa beans from cocoa farmers in Ghana. So this is something that a lot of the artisanal makers that, it's a growing space. We're having conversations around how do we allow ourselves to have the same amount of traceability and transparency that we would like to have, but also being able to connect directly with farmers to be able to really tell our story, but also understand everything about where our cocoa and our chocolate is coming from.
So does this also cause some concern for the farmer that might be selling directly to you because it's seen as illegal? So you kind of have to do everything offline, if you will.
So from my side, we've from the beginning, because of this sort of framework, have decided to start our journey as chocolatiers rather than chocolate makers. There are chocolate makers in Ghana who are buying legally and are able to come to agreements with licensed buying companies. Some others have come up with creative solutions where farmers are part of the company, so that they're actually, within. So there's different ways in which people are finding to work with the structures that are in place. But I would say that the laws, it depends on which angle you look at them. So from the perspective of a cocoa farmer, if the government's setting the price, even if the international price is lower, the government sets the price for the year. And sometimes the government is subsidizing to the cocoa farmers to make sure that they don't get below. And that's the way in which the laws were actually developed at the beginning, because the idea was to protect cocoa farmers. So, the space is evolving, and so the laws need to evolve with the reality. So, the government of Ghana has been talking about limiting or slowing down the amount of cocoa that's processed outside of Ghana in a way to have more processing happening in country. The implementation of all these laws will look different as the space evolves. I think one of the main elements, I would say, in terms of the farmers is that, how would I say it? I know Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire are neighbors, and we both have ways in which we are managing our crops. But I think when you look at the international space, the last few years, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire have been asking for a higher price for the cocoa beans. And there's a lot happening in this space to maintain a certain status quo. I think I'm sure we'll talk about it later, but when we talk about the price of chocolate, the price of cocoa beans and the cocoa farmers and the impact this has on their lives and their livelihoods, they're all interlinked. You cannot have one conversation without the other. So having a good understanding of the labor that goes into cocoa helps us to understand what the cocoa farmers are going through and what they need to have to make a good living. And when we look at the other side of what chocolate makers and others are making, there needs to be, it's a very complex conversation, but there needs to be ongoing and continued conversation for us to understand. As I'm looking at what's going on around us, even today, you'll see, there's now chocolate being made without cocoa. So what does that mean for all the thousands of cocoa farmers around the world? So as people who love chocolate, we really need to find ways to better communicate and understand that the resiliency is based on everybody winning.
Right, right. And now, one of the challenges that you mentioned was the heat and humidity. Where are your customers located? How are they getting to experience your amazing chocolates? And what are the logistics issues that you have?
So we have, we produce in Ghana and we make the chocolates in Ghana, the truffles, and then we ship them. So right now we're available in Ghana. We have, and then available in the US online. So we are doing direct to consumer in the US. So we have sort of a space of understanding what people want and then producing and sending it to the US. We're going to be doing a lot more of, pre-sales to make sure that we manage our stock levels. But what happens is we produce it in Ghana and we ship it to the US for it to be consumed there. Canada is also in line, and we have some retailers in Nigeria.
Now, what about the domestic market in Ghana? Like, what are their chocolate consumption habits that you've witnessed?
Yeah, as Christian mentioned, it's a challenge it's important for us to understand and make sure that there is local consumption. In Ghana, consumption is definitely low, and people are looking at different ways in which to increase it. We started in 2015, and it was all, local consumption. The market in Ghana is small, so in terms of actually being able to scale a business, you would need to look outside of Ghana to have a solid business. The country does consume, I would say truffles is not the main thing that people are consuming. People are consuming bars, people are consuming drinking chocolate, or hot chocolate, or in the case of breakfast drinks instead of tea and coffee. So these are ways in which we're currently consuming. There are programs that are in place that need to scale, but looking to introduce more chocolate consumption to the general public.
And is that something that you would do from like tastings and experiences, or like how does that typically work?
Yeah, so on my side, we have tastings on a regular basis. With COVID, we slowed down a bit, but we have tastings at our space. We also have tasting kits so that people can do it at home. During COVID, we wanted to make sure people were safe. So we were able to do that. So that's been part of it, but there's even there are local fairs. So there's a chocolate festival that's happening in Ghana on an annual basis. And so those are some of the ways in which we're trying to make sure people understand what the product is. I did the chocolate tastings also because truffles were sort of kind of newer to the market. People knew bars, but they weren't really sure about, the truffles. And so from a chef's perspective, it's been really nice to be able to talk about flavor and be able to have people explore their palate with the chocolates.
And speaking of the chef's perspective, there's a growing awareness of African flavors. I know the Culinary Institute of America is instituting some programs. I think you're involved in one of them. What are you seeing, kind of as a transition period right now where, at least in the US, audiences are more willing and open to explore different flavors that they've never had on their palate before?
Yeah, it's been exciting. I think even last year we submitted 2 of our products to Chocolate Alliance Awards, and we won for some of the flavors that we presented. So it's really exciting to see people being open to that. It's been exciting seeing sort of like a milk drinking chocolate next to something that had spices and flavors from Africa, and finding out that people were actually going for the ones with the spice rather than the sort of plain milk chocolate. I'm excited to see what happens, because at the end of the day, I really want to see smallhold farmers being able to gain more for their products, and actually some of these ingredients that are maybe a bit lost or forgotten coming to the international stage. I think that as chefs and as consumers, especially foodies, we are looking for something we haven't tried. You're looking for a new experience. And if we're able to channel that properly and make sure that the farmers who are producing and or the artisanal makers that are producing some of these, fermented ingredients that are coming from traditional preservation techniques can actually allow the farmers to have a living, can allow these flavors to stand the test of time, I think it's going to be amazing to see what happens. I'm excited for people to just kind of taste them and understand what the flavors are, and to introduce them to what they are already eating. I also think that there's some techniques and some biodiversity conversations, and so it's beyond sort of trying something new, but you're actually creating a new narrative for some of these ingredients, and that's just really wonderful.
And as far as the customer base, are you finding that these flavors are something that are gaining acceptance in Europe and say more the quote unquote traditional old guard culinary markets where, French or Italian cuisine tends to reign?
Yeah, I do see that, and it is shifting and changing. So, I would say even within the old guard, if you go to France, there's a lot of African restaurants that are coming up, and a lot of African chefs that are doing amazingly well there. So I think that.
So you're seeing people play with some of the ingredients and the flavors that you're using.
Definitely. I've seen it. If I can just take an example, there are spice companies that are now having some of these spices available in America. And so that's nice to see them in sort of normal grocery stores as you're moving around, and having people actually know what they are when you kind of reference them. That's
great. So as far as opportunities or that you're seeing for chocolate makers in Ghana, because I'm hearing more and more of chocolate makers from Ghana, where do you see the market going? I mean, is it something that it's focused on bean to bar, or is it more bonbons? Is it a combination of both? Is it more commercial?
I mean, it's probably a combination of both. I'm probably one of the crazy people that just wants to deal with the challenges and logistics. You're probably going to see a lot more bars because they're much more logistically easy to manage. You're going to I think that it's West Africa has a specific terroir, so you're going to get that chocolatey, whereas like a Madagascar, you might get more of the cherry notes coming through. So there's a wide range of flavors, but you've got Ghana, you've got Cote d'Ivoire, you've got Nigeria, we've got Cameroon, you know, so there's a lot of different, I would say I'm excited to see cocoa producing countries coming online and showcasing what we have. And I think that's the thing that's really exciting, and seeing how everyone is expressing it in their own space, in their own time.
Right. Well, and the one thing that one of the co-hosts, Jody Hayden, is working on right now, she's doing this flavor map, and she's testing and tasting flavors from Ecuador and other countries. And there's a tremendous amount of diversity in flavor in one country. And we tend to associate Ghana with like, this is just this generic flavor profile. Can you speak to the terroir and the diversity of cocoa flavors that you are seeing there?
I mean, I think one of the things that's really unique about Ghanaian cocoa is that it's fermented in the plantain or banana leaves. It's not done in Cote d'Ivoire that way. And I think that allows for sort of the second layer of flavor, if you will. So the terroir being the first, and the second being sort of the fermentation technique with the plantain. I've just really been enjoying a lot. I would say that in Ghana, a lot of our trees are from a certain band. So depending on, I think even, you know, within the same farm, depending on the rainfall that you're getting that year, depending on all these things, you are tasting the difference. And having the farmers coming online and being able to have conversations with farmers allows for that, us to even get more unique beans. I know in the last couple of years, we've had, I think, 1 or 2 Ghanaian farmers win taste awards in chocolate competitions or in cocoa competitions around the world. So I actually think that it's a moment where you will start to see more and more nuances coming from West Africa, and also us walking away from sort of this kind of monkey on our back, which has been around being a bulk cocoa space, and people actually really engaging with it.
That's wonderful. Now, what resources or support do you wish you had available, as far as, you know, whether it's from your government or trade associations to help grow the community?
I think in Ghana, in terms of a government policy or framework, I think going beyond sort of having more cocoa being processed in Ghana, we need to look at how are we training engineers to do equipment? How are we making sure that, for example, people who are bringing in equipment from outside, how do we do maintenance for our equipment? How are we training people doing food science? Or, you know, I would like to see educational programs that are allowing for equipment and to be maintained or built, looking for young people that are coming into the industry, knowing cocoa, knowing chocolate. I would love to see, you know, more sugar factories in West Africa, so that we can actually, we do have sugar cane. How are we going to get the sugar so that we can actually work through? So making sure some of these core ingredients are done. From a international trade point of view, I would love to have more of these conversations about the nuances of our beans, so that we can actually be in a space where we are talking about fine chocolate in West Africa on a consistent basis. From the consumer point of view, I would think that it's try cocoa and try chocolate coming from cocoa producing countries. Try West Africa, give it another shot. Try to see what the differences in the flavors are that are coming from that region. So that's what I would love to see more of.
So one of the conversations I had with somebody here in Chicago that owns a chocolate shop, I went in and I said, well, you know, how come you don't have any chocolate bars from Ghana on your shelves? And she talked about the child slavery. And so there's a tremendous narrative around cocoa from Ghana. And I don't want to, you know, end our conversation this way, but I definitely want to address, you know, the perception that the West has and people that don't live in Ghana, and the reality of what the farmers' lives are like, and some of the challenges that they face, and children especially. And so I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah. I'm always, it's a very sensitive subject, of course. Prior to going into cocoa, I worked for UNICEF for many years. I specialize particularly in child protection. So I am very sensitive to these conversations around this. There's a lot of diversity in what happens. So every village where cocoa is being grown is different. Every family is different. And I would say that there are processes in which we buy our cocoa, most of us, which is completely legal and which is safe for children, safe meaning that, there's no child labor involved in it. There are challenges in our space that we all need to work for. And I think the first challenge is when we talk about the price of cocoa. So if the price of cocoa is appropriate, and we know that the price of cocoa in West Africa is different than the price of cocoa in, let's say, South America, that's going to mean different things to how it's being processed. How do we improve the agricultural practices? How do we make it less labor intensive? How do we, improve some of those things to allow some of the things that don't happen the correct way to start happening correctly? In Ghana, for example, we have free primary education. So in general, these things should not be happening. It's possible that it is happening. I have not been to every single farm that there is, but generally speaking, most people that I know that are working in chocolate do their best to stay within the framework. So there are outliers, and I think it's going to take time. It's not going to happen overnight, but it's important for consumers to understand who's processing their chocolate and where it's coming from. But to embargo West Africa does not solve a problem. To say that we're going to consume cocoa-free chocolate is also not an answer. I think we need to actually do better as a community to make sure that we respect the labor that goes into cocoa and pay a fair price, and to make sure that one of the things that we used to always do when we talk about child protection is that there's systems. There's global, there's national, there's community, there is family. So in order to protect that child, all those sort of rings around the children need to be protected. So at a family level, what do those families need to make sure that the children are going to school? At the community level, how do we make sure that there's good health systems for those children and the families that are growing the cocoa? At a national, so there's responsibilities on each and every single level to make sure that we protect children. And we need to work together for that to happen. And it's beyond a cocoa farmer. It's the enabling environment for those children, those farmers, and for producers in general within those frameworks.
So one of the things that you also had mentioned was training like that next generation. So is part of the culture in Ghana, if your family has a cacao farm, they're growing cacao, that it is part of the normal experience to bring the child with? And at what age is that typically happening?
I don't have, full details on that. I would say that I think in terms of, I would say that if you look at families in general, I grew up helping my mom with chores. Right. And if you look at the US, in the Midwest, children help their families with chores. And if you look at generations past to present, probably the assistance that children do, whether it's on Saturday or Sunday, just chores at home, changes from over time. And so it's really difficult to say what happens in a family. It's very difficult to say that if you're in the village and your father needs you to bring him something on the farm, you're going to take him lunch. While you're there, are you going to do something? It's really very difficult to say. But yes, some of these communities are not the most wealthy, or they might be, lower on the scale. And so it's possible that some things happen, but it's also possible that somebody was just carrying something to their father. So it's really
it's very nuanced, is what you're saying.
Exactly, it is very nuanced.
And I think that's our challenge, at least in the US, where we want to have a very definitive, black and white. And like what you're saying is there's a lot of layers and everything that's involved in dealing with that.
Absolutely.
So we're going to move on to the EU and talk to Jack Steijn, who is the founder of Cacao. And Jack, I am thrilled to have you join us. And you want to tell us a little bit about your background in Cacao, which is coming up next month.
Yes, indeed. So my name is Jack Steijn. I'm the co-founder of Equipoise, and we are consultants in sustainable commodities, mainly cocoa. And the work we do is much related to sustainable supply chains, helping sustainably produced cocoa to enter into markets. So we also do some market research and helping chocolates to be sold in Europe. I actually worked with Selassie in a program financed by ITC when we were at the Salon de Chocolat in Paris with 3 other Ghanaian chocolate producers. So this is the kind of work we do, and we organize Cacao because we think that if you have good chocolates, you can make better cocoa out of. If you have good cocoa, you can make better chocolates out of that. And if you want to have a market for good cocoa, then you should provide one. And at the Cacao Trade Fair, we have this year something like 40 stands with cocoa producers from all over the world, including quite some from Ghana this year.
Yes.
And from other West African countries. So that's a new development. And we have a chocolate makers forum and a sustainable cocoa conference. So lots of things happening starting June 23rd. And this will be our 10th edition. So it's our second last term.
And do you have a theme for this year's conference? Is it, is an overarching theme, or do you just pick different topics that you like to focus on?
Actually, we have a discussion about the impact of new European legislation that we call the due diligence legislations. If you explain easily, it is that a company will be responsible and liable for everything that is happening in its supply chain. And a company can be sued, and even the management in person can be sued if any problems are found in their supply chain related to deforestation and human rights infringements, including child labor. And this really will have an impact on the cocoa sector because European Union consumes about 50% of all cocoa produced worldwide. So it is a huge market for cocoa. And all cocoa that enters into the European Union will have to have a label or a document saying where it comes from and who has produced it, and stating that there are no infringements to the deforestation and human rights happening in that supply chain, not only for cocoa, for everything that is being imported in the European Union, but also for cocoa. And that means that supply chains need to be transparent and traceable. Companies need to be aware of everything that is happening in the supply chain. It will have an impact on, for mainstream industry, on the part of the cocoa that they source indirectly, instead of directly from cooperatives they work with. It will have an impact on the terminal markets, and it will bring quite some investments in making that transparency happen. And then the question is, will that result into higher prices for cocoa, or to lower margins for the cocoa industry, or will the farmer suffer because he gets lower prices for the cocoa? And this is a topic that we will be discussing. Also, something that was just pointed out: how can we make sure that a larger part of the value chain of chocolate remains in cocoa producing countries? How can we help bean-to-bar chocolate makers, specialty chocolate makers in cocoa producing countries enter the European markets? How can we help European chocolate makers source even couverture in cocoa producing countries, because if you have your couverture produced maybe even at a cooperative, then for sure the farmer organization, the cocoa community, will have a larger share of the value of that product. So these are topics that are more or less related to what we heard before, talking about innovations. We'll have a cocoa juice drink producer, COA, talking about their innovations. There will be masterclasses, also indicating if you are participating in a chocolate award, how can you make sure that your chocolate stands out from the others? Because all chocolate that is now being sent to international awards is perfect, but then yours has to be more than perfect, because otherwise you don't stand out. Things like that. So it's a program of 3 days.
Now, you also have a network of women in cocoa and chocolate that you're involved with. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, the Women in Cocoa and Chocolate Network has been initiated, I think, in 2016 at an ICCO conference in the Dominican Republic, and ever since related to events, the larger events in the cocoa sector. So the World Cocoa Foundation, European Cocoa Association, related to those events, Women in Cocoa get together and have a program, sometimes educative, sometimes it's more about getting together and socializing. And this was a loose network, and it's now becoming a fixed organization. So women in cocoa throughout the world can adhere to that association if they support the goal of giving the women a voice in the cocoa sector. So that can be, for instance, with conferences, if a conference organizer wants to have more women on their panels and don't have access to names, then the network can provide them, and also helping women develop entrepreneurship skills and so on. So it's a wide program that is on offer. And people that are here that join the network, they support the development of that network, while at the same time they get some invitations for meetings and newsletters and things like that. But it's more about supporting a network that helps women get a voice in the cocoa sector.
That's wonderful. Now, what are some of the trends that you're seeing in chocolate in the EU? I know Christian's from France, and we're seeing a surge in bean to bar in France, but what are the other things that you're seeing?
Well, the first thing is actually there's not a single market.
Right.
There are quite some different markets in Europe, and it's very interesting to see what is happening, because if you look at, for instance, the market as a whole, you can say, is more or less saturated. There is not much growth in cocoa volume, but you can in chocolate volume, but you can see there is a growth in the cocoa contents of the same volume. So people tend to select chocolate bars with a higher cocoa content. But then if you differentiate, you see that the main consuming countries are Germany and not European Union, but Europe, Switzerland, Belgium, France, UK. Those are the main cocoa consuming countries. But countries like Estonia and Norway and Finland, Iceland even, that are relatively small, they have a huge consumption per head of the population. So that's very interesting. And you see all kinds of developments in the Nordic chocolate sector. So if you concentrate on specialty chocolates, there are very interesting developments in the Nordic countries going on, with intrusions that you wouldn't expect inclusions that you would not expect in chocolate bars and things like that. That's very interesting. You see France, Germany, Switzerland, the countries that are the main consumers, also the highest mainstream consumption. This is also where the specialty chocolate bar chocolate is growing more rapid than elsewhere. Spain, You see lots of new, young bean-to-bar chocolate makers popping up in France, in Spain, in Germany, and in the UK. Not as much in the Netherlands. If you look at the chocolate market, it is way behind, for instance, the specialty beer market or the specialty coffee market or other specialty markets. In Amsterdam, we used to have one brewer called Heineken. We now have 50 or 60 or so. And we still have less than 10 specialty chocolate makers in the Netherlands. So you see that we have a lot to learn from other markets there.
Wonderful. So I'm going to give a little bit of a recap of what I've been seeing in the US and just to kind of compare. One of the things that I found interesting in the research that the Fine Chocolate Industry Association did on chocolate was what motivates people to purchase chocolate. And if you had a guess, if it was brand, price, or mood, what would you think was the thing that wins all the time?
I would say mood.
You're right. It's a mood, and
Yeah.
you know, it's not necessarily based on price. It's not necessarily based on brand. It's what the consumer is thinking of at that moment. And the other thing that was interesting, 80% of US consumers are buying from multiple categories, meaning mass, premium, and fine. So they're not just dedicated or loyal to just fine chocolate. So that means that there is an opportunity in the US market to introduce people that maybe are not aware of fine chocolate, to get them to start enjoying it a little bit more. The categories of the demographics of the US market are kind of interesting. It's a lot of millennials from 25 to 40. They tend to live in urban areas, and they tend to come from more affluent households. So they see fine chocolate as a splurge, but they're also very environmentally concerned and socially engaged. So things like transparency and traceability are really important to them. And when we did the survey, transparency was important to 70% of them from fine chocolate, and traceability 71%. So those were really high numbers. And part of that conversation of these words, transparency and traceability, and what do they mean? The FCIA got together with Dr. Christy Leslie and some other members of the association who are going to be speaking later today, like Kate Cavalin, to really put together a glossary so that the public knows there's a common lexicon when they say a bonbon, or when they say chocolatier or chocolate maker, what that actually means. So we just released that this past week, and there's a link that I will share with everyone in the chat that allows people to go take a look at the list of the words, pick something that they think that they want to define, and then there's a process for defining it that you would need to state sources and references, and it gets reviewed. So it becomes this living and breathing document. And the goal is to really bring the stakeholders from all over, not just fine chocolate, but everyone, to the table and start having these conversations about chocolate.
It is actually what we see as well.
Yeah.
I've said in the very beginning that we do some market search for especially companies that are exporting into the European Union from cocoa producing countries. So we wanted to give them a picture of how the market looks like. And indeed, we see that millennials are on the forefront of changes as well. So they are very picky. They want organic. They want vegan. They're looking for less sugar content. So even if it's sugar, replace sugar with other sweeteners, higher percentages of cocoa. And it actually made us think that indeed you have fine chocolate, specialty chocolate, that may not be competing with confectionery chocolate. And it's because people tend to buy a fine chocolate bar while they at the same time would buy a confectionery chocolate bar. But confectionery chocolate is more competing with other snacks, whereas specialty chocolate would be competing with other specialty products.
Correct.
like coffee or
Yes.
whatever. And so they're not fully separate markets, but
Right.
it's not one or the other. It is something that a millennial could easily go and buy a milk chocolate bar in a supermarket, and then go at the same day to a specialty shop and buy a bean to bar chocolate bar.
Right. And we're
So
seeing
that's
that here.
that's interesting. It's not where we always thought it was a competition between mainstream, and it is more or less addressing another market.
And the other thing is, even the people that are consuming the mainstream products, they are still asking the questions about sustainability, transparency. They're demanding that. And so, you know, I was at a trade show yesterday with all the big chocolate players, Mars, Nestle, Barry Callebaut, and they're all looking at how they are going to address these issues as part of their supply chain, but then also from a consumer demand standpoint as well. So
it's true, and with the new European legislation, this is what they have to do. Because if a big one like Barry Callebaut, who buys about a quarter of the world's cocoa production, if in their supply chain something like deforestation or the worst forms of child labor is found, then you can actually sue the CEO of Barry Callebaut. So they will have to be very careful. And I think actually that it is maybe easier for, no, it's not easier, but also the bean to bar chocolate makers in Europe will have to have their supply chain in order.
yes,
They will also have to show that there are no human rights infringements or deforestation. And it may even be more difficult for a small bean to bar chocolate maker to do so. These developments are happening, and they're influencing everybody's supply chain. We are now working with a new initiative called Into Choco, and this is helping the bean to bar chocolate makers get some transparency in their supply chains. And I think initiatives like those are needed because the consumer asks this from the big ones like Mars and what have you, but he also asks this, or she, from any bean to bar chocolate, and it's quite expensive to be transparent, but this is what you need to do.
Absolutely. So I want to leave some time for Q&A, and I am trying to see if I'm going to be reading some of these questions from the chat, or if Gina is going to be joining us and reading some of the questions that she's getting on any other channel. I'm going to go ahead and start off with one here I have here in the Q&A real quick. Is the due diligence legislation you talked about already effectuated, and where could they read more about it?
No, it's not effectuated. The European Commission has introduced two legislative proposals, one regarding deforestation, the other one regarding human rights infringements. And they're not exactly the same. At this moment, it's still being discussed. At this moment, there is no threshold as to size of companies for the human rights infringement proposal. And there is one at quite a high level for the deforestation proposal. So that will probably not be important for bean to bar chocolate makers. It has been proposed. Discussions are now going on. European Parliament has already said that they wanted to have those propositions. So I will think it will pass through the Parliament quite smoothly once it's there. And then there's a discussion between the member states, and we have 27 of them. So depending on the attitude of most of the member states, it can take some time. My guess is that it would be effective between now and 2 years.
So Gina, were you going to go ahead and?
Yes, let me chime in here. We've got questions coming in on multiple channels. And Ephi only has one set of eyeballs, so I'm going to help out here. We actually have a question that I'm interested in as well. It has to do with Cacao chocolate that doesn't actually have any cacao in it. Christian had talked about this, and a number of audience members would like to hear more. What is this chocolate that isn't really chocolate? Could you explain?
Who are you asking?
I think the question was directed towards Christian.
Sí, yo creo que uno de los problemas que tenemos en América Latina es en la definición de la palabra chocolate. Aquí no existe una definición con un porcentaje mínimo de cacao dentro de la fórmula de fabricación del chocolate. Entonces, por eso tenemos algunos productos que se venden como chocolate en los supermercados, en las perchas de chocolate, que son productos que no tienen chocolate, tienen un sustituto de productos elaborados que se parecen a nivel de sabor a chocolate, pero que no es chocolate. Entonces, yo creo que una de las primeras medidas a tomar a nivel legislativo es obligar a tener una definición clara del término chocolate para que después solamente se pueda vender este producto cuando tenga un mínimo de, no sé, 10, 15, 20% de cacao dentro de su composición. Eso es uno de los primeros temas. Ahora, una pregunta que me llegó por interno y que quería insistir, porque creo mucho se habla del tema de las variedades, de los cacaos finos de aroma versus los cacaos convencionales, o en Ecuador versus el CCN 51. Yo creo que una cosa muy importante de entender es que el chocolatero, para fabricar un buen chocolate, ante todo lo que necesita son perfiles aromáticos especiales. Hablamos de perfiles florales, perfiles frutales, sabores a nueces, especies. Y lo que hay que entender es que la calidad para obtener un perfil depende de tres cosas. La primera cosa depende de las condiciones biofísicas, es decir, el clima, el suelo, el relieve, donde se realiza el cultivo. Entonces, eso es una cosa que nos da la naturaleza, que no lo podemos tocar. El segundo elemento depende del factor biológico, que es la variedad. Entonces, ahí tenemos variedades, grupos de variedades dentro de los pinos de aroma, tenemos algunos clones, pero la variedad es solamente uno de los factores. Y eso es un tema biológico, el productor elige tal o tal tipo de variedad. Y la tercera cosa es el tema de las prácticas humanas, es decir, el factor humano, es decir, ¿qué hace el productor en el sistema de producción, en la poda, en la forma en la cual cosecha, en la forma en la cual fermenta, en la forma en la cual seca? Y al final la calidad es una mezcla de estos tres factores, biofísico, genético y humano. Y si uno de estos tres factores falla, no sirve de nada tener la mejor variedad del mundo si no se la fermenta bien o si no se la cosecha bien. Igual podemos tener una muy buena variedad, muy bien cultivada, pero si está en un lugar no apto, no va a conseguir un perfil aromático importante. Entonces, yo creo que ahí es importante entender que la calidad es el resultado de esos tres temas, y ahí el concepto de la denominación de origen, que justamente es un concepto ya protegido a nivel de propiedad intelectual, que permite obtener garantías sobre un producto que viene de tal zona, que corresponde a condiciones de producción y que nos va a dar al final un perfil aromático constante. Entonces, este tema de poder elaborar mapas aromáticos de los cacaos en diferentes países, un mapa organoléptico, por ejemplo, en el Ecuador se ha ido y se está queriendo seguir en este camino de proponer perfiles, por ejemplo, el cacao de Muisne, el cacao de Naranjal, el cacao de Manabí, que va a tener características organolépticas especiales, que es el resultado de esta combinación de esos tres factores.
Maybe replying, not replying to the last statement, but on the one on the lab-grown cocoa, which I called Frankenstein chocolate in a discussion earlier. This chocolate in Europe could not be sold as chocolate because, contrary to apparently the situation in Ecuador, There are strict legal definitions of the cocoa content that everything needs to have if it's is selling as chocolates for white chocolate, for milk chocolate, for dark chocolate. So this will not meet those requirements. I think there are 3 initiatives in this field. QOA is one of them. We are trying to have one of them on the Cacao conference. But it is something I have even seen I think a tasting of chocolates, probably even organized by FCIA, where it turned out that it was not that much worse as compared to the cocoa that the others were tasting. But it is not chocolate, and that's the main thing. And the other thing is that if it's being sold as a product that you should choose because it does not harm children, there's no child labor involved, there's no deforestation involved, there is no human rights infringement in general involved, then you're on the wrong track, because it's not involved, that's for sure, but you're not helping find solutions to these problems neither. So that should be made very clear. For legal grounds in Europe, it's not chocolate. You cannot sell it as chocolate. It can be a very good product and it can have a very good taste, but you should not sell it as sustainable product because it does not have the sustainability issues. No, it doesn't help solve the sustainability issues. So you should stay away from those statements.
And I just think in terms of what you were saying about dealing with the issue, it's important for us to actually just talk about consumption of whatever it is as we as humans consume, because if it's going to be another product that's going to be fermented instead of cocoa beans, we fall back into the same problem. So it's really about how do we make sure that we do understand that everything we do has an impact and trying to understand what that impact is.
Okay, yeah, those are all really good points. The question was asked multiple times. Also, another question we're seeing popping up repeatedly is about, how specifically small producers in the cacao producing countries are going to be able to comply with the new requirements coming online in the European Union. They're supposed to guarantee things like no deforestation, certain levels of human rights being respected. How is it that, small producers are going to be able to react to this, and how is this going to help or, harm fine cacao and chocolate in Europe? And you can all take a stab at that. I think, Jack, you're in Europe right now, but please, everyone's involved in this somehow. So.
Well, if I would kick this off, we have the discussions going on at this moment. At the political level, all lobby platforms are involved in discussions and so on. But what I'm seeing is that very few people at this moment are talking about the risks for the small cocoa producers. And of course, everybody wants this to happen because everybody is expecting a lot of positive impact from this. But indeed, one should also take a step back and see what might happen. Like the question, who is going to pay for this? Is this going to lead to less margins for the industry, higher prices for the consumer? But everybody already knows that it is the one who is the weakest link who might be paying for this. If companies are sourcing only from origins they trust, what will happen to upcoming cocoa countries? I've been to the cocoa sectors in Sierra Leone and Liberia, and I know that they will have lots of difficulties in meeting those requirements. But traveling through outer districts of Ghana cocoa production areas, you see the same thing. So I think that whilst establishing this legislation, we have to do what we can to make sure that it really benefits the smallholder, and this is the intention of everybody, that everybody also explores the risks that it may have for the small producer.
I see, Christian, you're raising your hand. Christian, would you like to
Sí,
chime in?
sobre eso, esta resolución de la Unión Europea para prohibir la importación de productos con riesgos de deforestación, que se aplica a 6 productos, dentro del cual está el cacao, que es de noviembre de 2021. Todavía el reglamento de aplicación de esta resolución está en discusión y está bastante peleada por intereses específicos. Y el tema muy importante es de saber qué año de referencia se va a tomar. Inicialmente se hablaba del año 2010, después del año 2015. Actualmente se estaría hablando más del año 2020. Si se habla del año 2020, es no haber tenido deforestación en los 2 últimos años, y eso obviamente deja libre una gran cantidad de superficie de cacao ya sembrado en parcelas que son resultado de la deforestación. Ahora, el problema va a ser más que todo poder demostrar eso a través de un sistema de trazabilidad. Y ahí, no sé cómo está en los otros países, pero por ejemplo, un ejemplo como Ecuador, actualmente menos del 10% de la superficie nacional está sujeto a trazabilidad. Y eso significaría que para poder ingresar al mercado europeo, el exportador va a tener que demostrar que el lote que está exportando es un lote libre de deforestación a través de un sistema de trazabilidad hasta la parcela. Entonces, el gran desafío es armar un sistema que se pueda mantener por sí mismo, un sistema de trazabilidad, porque eso tiene un costo. ¿Y quién va a pagar para este costo? A partir del momento que es el importador que requiere de esta información para sus consumidores, sería lógico que este sobrecosto que implica un sistema de trazabilidad puede ser repercutado hasta el nivel del consumidor o del chocolatero, o por lo menos del importador de cacao. Pero yo creo que es un desafío muy grande para los próximos años todo este tema de la trazabilidad, para justamente poder demostrar que el cacao es un cultivo que no contribuye a la deforestación y que más bien tiene un balance a nivel de carbono positivo y que contribuye justamente al mejoramiento de las condiciones del cambio climático.
Right, thank you very much. Selassie, is there anything you want to add to that, especially from the perspective of Ghana, where you're selling to the government and then the government is selling? How do you feel that would be affected by these European laws? And we've got about 1 minute, just so you know.
Wow, I mean, I think for it will have an impact. It's going to be hard to see. There's going to be need for pressures to come from around for this to work and to be impacted. But I think when you look at the cocoa farmer, they already know that they need more than one crop. So I think when we're talking about multi-cropping and diversity of crops and different things growing for different parts of their season, it's really important for them. So I think there will need to be pressure from the different bodies, from cocoa farmers to artisanal makers like myself, to support this work.
All right. Well, Ephi, would you like some last words? That's all we have time for.
I would just like to thank everyone from joining us from like the 4 corners of the globe this morning. This was a fascinating conversation, and I probably could have talked for another couple of hours. But all of you, thank you so much. And thank you for the work that you are doing in your respective sectors of the chocolate and cacao value chain. And I also would like to thank the summit for bringing these voices together. It's a valuable conversation. We need to have more of them.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us, Christian, Jack, Selassie, and Ephi, of course. Thank you very much. We hope you'll stick around for more conversations today.
Thank you.